Now, if you're at all like me, you knew the name of the Dreyfus case and may have known enough to speak an ambiguous sentence about it with some small degree of confidence. Maybe I heard about it in my high school history class. If so, I was in no condition to do more than identify it for a quiz, probably. Also, I suspect that when it was delivered to me in a classroom somewhere, we were asked to name its primary factors or moments, not its broader implications for the anti-Semitic programs which are growing through Europe. Arendt specifically is not offering the legal details of the case. She's not a lawyer. We're not going to read this chapter and relitigate or expose a cover-up. Importantly, at this point, that really matters far less than the broader issues we might learn. And it is why Arendt calls this chapter the Dreyfus Affair, not merely the case. The Dreyfus Affair in France, from 1894 to 1906 and afterwards, is nothing less than a dress rehearsal for the upcoming catastrophe. Now, I won't go through all the details either, but only say that a French captain, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, was wrongly convicted of treason and sent to a punishing penal colony. A whistleblower on the frame-up was transferred abroad, and what followed was kind of a clown car of military officers working to disguise and cover up, with aristocrats and politicians hiding their financial records to avoid scrutiny on a Panama Canal disaster, and seemingly every contingent from France inflamed about the Jew who betrayed the country. The Catholic Church aligned with the army in the efforts to prosecute Dreyfus, and as the mobs and newspapers grew more incensed and the anti-Semitic rhetoric grew, only a few writers and journalists dared to defend him. So obviously had Dreyfus become a scapegoat to a much larger story of corruption and greed. These folks, the defenders, the Dreyfusards, included journalist Georges Clemenceau, who would later become French Prime Minister. He dared assert a general claim for human rights and fair trials. Significantly, even despite the obvious corruption and nonsense stories that were invented in Dreyfus's persecution, almost every major institution, the rich, the church, the army, the politicians, were all hell-bent on making Dreyfus the sacrifice to their own corruption and mismanagement. Whether he committed any criminal act or not was more or less irrelevant to this larger aim. In other words, there was seemingly no one at the helm of France to carry on law and justice. Who would defend these principles? A few writers? An exiled army officer? A journalist or two? The answer is yes, just them. Buying Émile Zola's newspaper and reading Clemenceau's editorials were about 300,000 French from every level of society and class, none of them ever a coherent faction, but all piecemeal believers, unswayed by the propaganda and anti-Semitic nonsense. As Arendt puts it, the whole of France's political life during the Dreyfus crisis was carried on outside of Parliament. And is that true, then, that there are ever only a handful who will adhere to principles of rights and justice and must fight from the margins? Maybe. Because shame is not enough to motivate the criminal to stop. Exposing the rhetoric as false is insufficient to persuade, and social allegiances do not make for principled ones. But a continuous reminder, a counter-narrative to the corruption, a lance against the anti-Semitic imagery, may wrest its way through. And it didn't hurt that the exiled army whistleblower, an intelligence officer, was an otherwise good Catholic, had a good position for advancement, had demonstrated his own anti-Jew behaviors, and had not yet been convinced that the end justifies the means. Such a precipice. So obvious was the warning that not all was well in France and in the broader European nation-state. But when Dreyfus was finally returned and evidence of cover-ups emerged and a retrial was demanded to clear his name, the Parliament chose a blanket pardon instead, choosing not to make the issue more public than it already was. What's more, their motivation for doing anything at all was not the journalists and writers, nor even the 300,000 readers of their newspapers. It may well have been the fear of an international boycott of the upcoming World's Fair of 1900 to be held in Paris. So much for principles. In the end, economics wins the day? I know this. No matter what my class taught me, and I have since forgotten about the Dreyfus affair, this story of marginalized fighters for principle and law did not reach me, nor did its politically expedient conclusion. So expedient and so complete was this erasure of the scandal from our international memory that it wasn't until after the Holocaust that historians began to look again, to think over its lessons, to reflect on its meaning. Because as history happens to us, we seem incapable as a broader society of understanding what we're doing, of holding ourselves accountable.